First, who is the author? As you see here, Lorenzo Albacete is a Roman Catholic priest. But prior to becoming a priest, he was already a professional physicist, so a highly educated scientist. And Albacete was actually very close friends to John Paul II, now Pope Saint John Paul II. And in 1997, he was invited to be the consultant for a PBS Frontline series. The series covered the contemporary challenges in human culture in contrast to the teachings of JP2, the culture of life with which JP2 taught and promoted for the world. As part of this, Lorenzo Albacete found himself at the Carlton Ritz, a fancy hotel in Pasadena, California, with all these famous persons. And so we get the title of the book that came out of his experience, and that is God at the Ritz. Now, it's a subtitle that gives you an idea of what this is all about. And the subtitle is Attraction to Infinity. Our hearts, human nature, are drawn to something more, something beyond ourselves. And this was Albacete's real experience, being at the Carlton Ritz, being the religious expert, in a sense, about matters pertaining to the legacy of JP2, as well as the teachings of the Catholic Church. So he found himself bombarded with questions. And these were questions about the very nature of the religious claim to truth. Questions that are very personal to every human being, because they are questions of ultimate value. Questions of what happens after death? Is there life after death? How do we distinguish between good and evil? What's the relationship of science and faith, religion and politics? So he describes in his introduction, as you saw, he uses a Puerto Rican expression to describe how he felt at the Carlton Ritz. He felt like a cockroach at a party of hens. He was being pecked to death by these questions. But amidst the rather daunting experience, he recognized a commonality. The questions were not asked out of malice, but rather there was a real yearning for the deeper questions and answers about our lives. The commonality of a common love for life, a desire for happiness, a passion for truth and justice, respect and freedom. So, reflecting on his experience, he knew he didn't have all the answers, but he knew where to turn to look for the answers, this long-standing religious tradition in the Christian faith. And in sum, he realized that everyone has these questions. Everyone wants to live life to the full. Every human being is on a search for truth and beauty, justice, solidarity, and ultimately happiness. So, following after his experiences with the PBS series, he decided to pen some of his reflections. And so we have this marvelous little work, God at the Ritz. It's been through many editions, and it's been a very successful publication. I think it's very accessible. I hope you agree. Albacete is apparently pretty funny. He's got a good sense of humor, so if you read between the lines, you'll get a chuckle here and there. But already in the introduction, and what we'll do in this first part of the lecture is we're going to follow through the ordering of his presentation from chapters 1 to 3. So he starts his discussion with that question of, is religion a lot of bull? And this for him was actually a joke that he came up with himself while traveling. And he says he does quite a bit of travels, so every time he's sitting in a plane seat, he'll look at the pocket seat in front of him, pull out the magazine, and invariably, it will be something of, Journal of Prehistoric Studies or those ad magazines. But he says more often than not, he'll find over and over again some archaeological study in which prehistorical human dwellings were found. And they'll find artifacts and tools and crafts and pottery from the ancient cultures, from the cavemen. But the most stunning feature, he says, that repeatedly appear in all of these discoveries are the cave drawings. So apparently the first caveman was already doodling on the wall, but it was more than just doodles, because there's a consistent theme that reappears every time, and it's the image of the bull. So this isn't incomprehensible prehistoric graffiti, he says, but rather there's a meaning that is to be explored. The drawings, cave drawings of the bull by the prehistoric man was an indicator of the primitive religious art, meaning there's a primitive religious orientation in the very first human existence. The bull was a religious symbol of some sort for the caveman. It was a symbol of strength and power, and more often than not, of livelihood. And so Albacete says, well, when you're kind of squashed in the middle of, two very small or three very small plane seats, then you come up with these silly jokes. And his joke is, well, in prehistoric times, you'd be considered a mystic if you said that religion was a lot of bull. So, chuckle, chuckle. But that leads us directly into the first chapter, which he entitles From Bulls to Chickens, noting that there is seemingly this universal phenomenon of cave drawings of bulls, manifesting the religious orientation of the very first man. And archaeologically, we can trace this back. The scientists have actually done so, and they say that religious behavior seemingly has emerged around the Upper Paleolithic era. So we're reaching far back into the Paleolithic era, which is as far as 2.5 million years ago. But the Upper Paleolithic era, which is the period before moving into the Mesolithic, dates back about 30,000 years BC. And this is where we see evidence of religious activity. The Neanderthal man had intentional burial rites. The caveman did not simply dispose of the remains of their dead, but rather there was intentional ritual. And seemingly the bodies which are now being discovered, the remains, were laid in a particular position. And oftentimes there were particular objects that were set next to them, almost as a fetish. It reveals that even the caveman thought that life does not end simply with death. There's a life beyond death. There's a journey ahead. And so in their burial rites, there's evidence of some kind of cognition of life after death, some recognition of an infinite beyond. Man is not made simply for this world, this life alone. We're made for something more, as we saw Aquinas say last week. Lots of evidence of this if you're interested in archaeology. This image here is called the Venus of Willendorf. She's now housed in a museum in Willendorf, Austria. And it's actually a very small figurine, about 11 centimeters high, a little bit, about 4 inches. And it's a feminine figure, obviously. The figure has no visible face. Her head is covered. There are like circular bands. There's no personal facial features, so she's kind of a generic figure, and maybe she's got on that headdress. What is kind of emphasized here is the parts of the body that are associated with fertility and childbearing, her breasts, her womb, her belly. There's great emphasis on parts of her body. And this has led archaeologists to believe that this figurine was used as a fertility fetish, similar to some goddess of fertility, or a charm for bringing fertile, abundant harvests or personal fertility. So again, this is an example, an indication of the human orientation to something beyond itself. The very first man, early man, knew that he himself was not God, and there was a power beyond. And the human heart is oriented to something beyond himself, to a transcendence. Now, Albacete titles this chapter From Bulls to Chickens, and he says that, well, the prehistoric man rather worshipped the bull, and the modern man has kind of left the bull behind, and seemingly it's the chicken now. And what is he referring to here? He is looking at the literary phenomenon that was very popular during the time he was writing this, and that was the book series Chicken Soup for the Soul, and there's chicken soup for every kind of soul. But to Albacete, this book series is likened to like the Dummies series. So it reflects on human life on a very mundane level. And it even wants to wash away the mystery of it. So these are inspirational stories that maybe touch the heart in a sentimental way, but it doesn't look at the grandeur and the depth and the mystery and the awesomeness of human life. And so he says that the modern man is similar to what Flannery O'Connor calls the wingless chicken. And that's what you see on the screen here. Now, if you know anything about chicken farming, there's a technique in which the wings of the chicken are clipped off, so that the chicken without any wings does not get the proper exercise, and so it grows plump and fat and juicy, and it's more pleasing to the human palate. And Albacete will say that the modern man, too, has become existentially fatter. We are comfortable in our very mundane lives. We don't look for something beyond. We've lost a dimension of transcendence, and we've become two-dimensional rather than being three-dimensional. We've flattened out our human existence. Another image that I would like to propose to you, very similarly with the same idea, is the image of the squirrel. And squirrels are wonderful creatures. So if you ever have a free day or some free time, just walk through campus or sit at a park and enjoy the sunshine and the breeze and watch the squirrels. They're a lot of fun to watch. So they scurry about, they run up and down, they'll swing from branch to branch. But the interesting thing here is, imagine, you never see a squirrel kind of stop dead in its tracks, roll over on its belly, throw its arm on its head, and say, this squirrel life, why do I love nuts so much? What's the point of all of this? All of this activity, what's the point of it? Squirrels don't do that. But human beings do. We have identity crises. We have existential crises. We question the meaning of our existence because there is something intrinsically different between the human species and the squirrel species. Human beings are made in the image of God. We are made by God, for God, and will be fulfilled only in God. We don't want to be wingless chicken. We don't want to be squirrels. We want to be the full human being that God has created us to be. And that is what is called the Homo religiosus. It's that innate, inherent orientation to the transcendent, to a God of some sort, even if it is a pagan God or a worship of elements of nature as found in very primitive human civilization. Human beings innately desire God. We innately desire transcendence. Whether or not we acknowledge it, we can shut out that longing in our hearts, fill it up with noise, keep ourselves busy, but that longing is there and it will nag at our happiness and our peace. And we can attend to it because God, who gave us this longing, wants to fulfill it. And so Albacete ends, or he concludes what he says in chapter 1 with these words on page 19. So we can take a read of that. He says, but the religious experience is more than that, and more than what we see in the wingless chicken. It originates on a level deeper than the psychological, and it takes us beyond all imaginable limits. It takes us to infinity. We have lost the capacity to experience this range of possibilities. Not that all of us were soaring eagles like the mystics, but at least we could hop a little. The chicken with wings could hop. We could hop up and move toward the infinity of the holy, or hop down into the depths of the holy. But now we no longer know how to hop up and down. We are wingless chicken. The religious impulse, this religious innate desire, the desire to hop up and down, or in more religious language, to long for an encounter with the holy, it remains as powerful as ever. It is, shall we say, as strong as a bull. Perhaps that's why, so many centuries ago, our ancestors painted those captivating and powerful images of bulls on the walls of torchlit caves. Perhaps that's why we look in airport bookstores for chicken soup and other books that will feed our spiritual hunger. We long for God. So in the stillness of our hearts, we should and can, we are able to acknowledge that hunger, identify it, and now pursue it. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, the reference book for this course, also speaks of this innate desire for God. Now, please note that the numbers that are provided referencing the Catechism are not page numbers, so there are very many different editions of the Catechism, and so the page numbers will differ, but the paragraph numbers will always remain the same. So the numbers given are always paragraph numbers. So in paragraph 27, we read, this is church teaching, that the desire for God is written in the human heart, because man is created by God and for God, and God never ceases to draw man to himself. Okay, that's summarizing that religious impulse, that religious homo religiosus, that we have a desire for God deep down inside. Why do we have this? Because we were created this way, unlike the rest of the created universe. Humankind has this innate desire for God. And not only that, but we will find fulfillment. This desire is given to us so that it can come to full flourishing in our union with God. Because God does not just give it to us and laugh and say, I will leave you in eternal frustration, but rather he never ceases to draw us closer to him. Only in God, therefore, will man find the truth and happiness he never stops searching for. And then in paragraph 28, the Catechism says, in many ways, throughout history, down to the present day, men have given expression to their quest for God in their religious beliefs and behavior. These forms of religious expression, despite the ambiguities they often bring with them, are so universal that one may well call man a religious being. So it is evident throughout human history that there is this real longing. It's only the postmodern man who has shut out this longing and chosen to merely look at the earth, merely look at the dirt, and not look up in search of God. A figure in history who exemplifies this longing for what is holy, longing for what is beyond himself, is St. Augustine. And Augustine, as you may know, was a very promising young man who was extremely intelligent, and he was ascending the ladder of success in society at leaps and bounds. And yet he did not find his heart's fulfillment. He even had his own lover. He had a child with his lover. But as much as he found joy in the pleasures of the flesh and the accolades of the world, he knew there was something lacking in his heart, and he kept searching. He listened to that quiet whisper within his heart, and eventually he became a Christian, and ultimately a bishop and a saint. As a bishop, he wrote his autobiography, a very famous one. It is called the Confessions, and he starts that autobiography with these words that manifest for us the Homo religiosus. So Augustine says, "O Lord, you have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." Think about what you hold in your heart right now, what your desires are, what restlessness there is deep within. All of the desires of the human heart, all the good desires, are small steps towards the ultimate desire that wants to be fulfilled infinitely in God alone. So the first chapter of Albacete's God of the Ritz looks at this religious dimension, going from bulls to chicken. So Albacete is saying, the modern man has forgotten who he really is. He's made a god of himself. And he follows chapter 1 with a chapter examining 3 figures of human history, recent human history, that exemplify this modern, postmodern understanding. And following scholars before him, Albacete calls these 3 the masters of suspicion. These include Sigmund Freud, the father of modern psychology, Karl Marx, and Friedrich Nietzsche. So we'll spend a little bit of time on the first 2 and more time, or most of our time, on Nietzsche. Now, these men are called the masters of suspicion because they look at the religious experience, that innate desire for something beyond ourselves, seeking fulfillment in God and in an other, not making myself the center of the universe. All of what entails the religious experience is put under scrutiny and becomes suspect in the lens of these 3 thinkers, Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche. So what do we know of each of them? Well, of course, Sigmund Freud is the father of modern psychology, the founder of psychoanalysis. Freud will look to religion and explain it away as a human concoction. It's the source of our sexual repression, resulting in psychological illness. Religion, in Freud's eyes, is a projection of the unresolved psychosexual tensions within our own being. And if you know a little bit about Freudian psychology, you've heard of the Oedipus complex. That's the son's desire to possess sexually his own mother. And this is rooted in Sophocles' ancient Greek tragedy. And if you recall the story, Oedipus, from the moment of his birth, there was an oracle spoken about him that would lead to the downfall of his father, his family. His father was the king. And so to preserve the king and the kingdom, he was sent away, left to die by fate. He was rescued by simple shepherdsmen and given to another family. Well, Oedipus grows up and he somehow learns about this oracle about him. And the oracle says, fleshing out how he will be the downfall of his family, the oracle spoke of Oedipus as one who would kill his father and marry his mother. So in order to escape this oracle that has been spoken of him, he runs away from the only family that he knew. And ironically, as fate would have it, he was running back to his actual original biological family. And the prophecy plays out. He does actually kill his own father, not knowing that is his father. And then because now the king is dead, Oedipus, who solves the riddle, is actually held by the peoples as the new king, and so he marries his mother. So the prophecy is fulfilled. It's revealed at the end of this great tragedy, and Oedipus gouges out his eyes. So here he is being led by his sister. But the idea is that all of human ills, human difficulties and suffering are rooted in our infantile sexual desires that are repressed because religion is like a yoke that's put upon us and does not allow us to act out of our natural instincts. Now, in the religious sense, as Albacete will describe it, the religious experience is not devoid or condemning of the sexual experience. Rather, sex is something created by God. God invites humankind to be fertile and multiply, and we'll see this when we read Genesis later on in the semester. There's something more to be said that Freud does not see. So Freud is the first master of suspicion. Secondly, we look at Karl Marx. And Marx, as you know, with Engels, wrote his Communist Manifesto in 1948. And this is a theory of economics, right? Everything is focused on work and production, and human labor mediates between the human being, the individual person, and the earth, because he's working the earth, and the fruit of his labor is what he produces. And Marx will argue that the product of human labor belongs in common to everyone. And yet, the system of capitalism, or the structure of society which allows for private property, goes against this. Because now what you have is a society in which there is the wealthy and the working class. It's the wealthy that own the land. It's the working class that actually work the land. And the wealthy who own the land benefit from the profits of the labor of the poor and the weak. And so there seems to be an injustice here. Human history, for Marx, is driven by a conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the rich and the working class. So it's always about a class struggle. And progress in history, for Marx, is always marked by the overthrow of the ruling class, the revolution, in order to reinstate some form of communism or really socialism. So it's a theory of economics. What does religion have to do with this Communist Manifesto outlook that Marx offers to the world? What does it have to do with socialism and the redistribution of wealth? Well, Marx has this famous line. He refers to religion as the sigh of the oppressed, the sentiments of a loveless world, and the soul of the soulless conditions. Religion is the opium of the masses. So what Marx is saying is that in this corrupt system, in which the wealthy oppress and exploit the labors of the poor, it's religion that enables it. Because religion will teach the poor, the working class, to do your best, suffer in this life willingly, and you'll be rewarded in the next. So religion is controlled by the rulers. It's the opiate of the masses. And next we have Friedrich Nietzsche, who was born in Prussia on October 15th, 1844. That date happened to be the birth date of the king, Friedrich Wilhelm IV, and so the baby was named after the king, Friedrich. Today we call him Nietzsche, very, very famous existentialist philosopher. Nietzsche's father was a Lutheran pastor, and he died of mental illness when Nietzsche was only 5 years old. From that point forward, he was cared for by his mother, and Nietzsche himself will suffer mental illness. He will have a mental breakdown near the end of his life, and throughout his life he suffered extreme headaches all the time. Nietzsche is the exemplary figure of existentialism, and that's the philosophical school that emphasizes human existence and the individual person of human existence as a free and responsible agent who determines his own identity through his own acts of his will. And that, as you see, is coupled with nihilism, and you have the root nihil, the root for nothing, as in to annihilate is to bring to nothing. There's nothing there. There are no intrinsic values. And nihilism, existentialism, anticipates the 20th century's crisis of meaning, because there's no intrinsic value or meaning to anything. Now, if I ask you what are some values you hold, you may identify the value of life, of your faith, maybe of individuality, of creativity. Well, who says those things are good? Existentialist nihilism will say there are no intrinsic values. Values do not exist in themselves, but rather it is the individual human being who instills those values. And each of us, we must choose our own values. We must choose for something to be good. We do not look to an other, to a God, to someone who is not human, to tell us what is actually valuable and good. So that's the heart of existential nihilism. There are two main points that we want to look at with regard to Nietzsche and what he will say about religion and the religious experience. The first of these is Great Aphorism 125, which speaks of God as dead. God is dead. We have killed him. Now, this is Nietzsche's critique of Christianity. Okay, we'll look at that in a second. And then in response to the status quo of the world, there is no God, then he will propose that we need to raise up an Übermensch. Über is the German word for super, Mensch, man. This is the Superman of the human race. This is the hope. Okay, everything is focused on this power to dominate, this will to power. Okay, so we'll unpack each of these words. Let's first turn to look at the parable of the madman.
Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace, and cried incessantly, "I see God! I see God!" As many of those who did not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. "Has he got lost?" asked one. "Did he lose his way like a child?" asked another. "Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage? Emigrated?" Thus they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. "Whither is God?" he cried. "I will tell you. We have killed him. You and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually? Backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? Do we hear nothing as of yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing yet of the divine decomposition? Gods too decompose. God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him.
So we can pause here and notice how Nietzsche sets up this parable. The irony of this madman who goes into the marketplace in broad daylight, and he's lit a lantern as if it's dark, but it's in broad daylight. And he's saying, "I'm looking for God." And the people around him jeer and laugh. What, do you mean he's lost? Did he run away? Is he hiding? Is he on a voyage? So they yell and they laugh at him. But actually the madman is the one who has a keen sense of reality. That's the irony of it. And so this is when the madman jumps into their midst and says to them, "Whither is God? I will tell you, we have killed him. The human race, you and I, we have killed God." Now, what does Nietzsche mean by this? He doesn't mean that we've committed homicide or deicide, killing off God, but rather the reality of our world today speaks to a reality that does not need God. God does not exist in our human consciousness anymore. Okay? And if he does, he's simply some remote memory. And Nietzsche, in The Voice of the Madman, questions, after stating that we are the murderers of God. Well, how did we do this? Is this possible? Okay? Because the deed is akin to having drunk up the sea, taking a sponge and wiping away the horizon. And he likens it further to, we've unchained this earth from the sun. It's as if, for as long as we still recognize religion and recognize God's place, and we still bow and submit to God, it's as if we, the earth, has been chained, shackled to the sun, and now we are free. But guess what? What is the consequence of this? If God no longer exists, if there are no intrinsic values, if everything that we've been taught does not hold any ground, then whither is the earth now moving now that it's been freed from being chained to the sun? Whither are we moving? Are we moving away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually? Are we moving backwards, sideways, forwards, in all directions? Or is there any direction at all? There's no longer any up or down, forward, backward. Are we straying as though through an infinite nothing? Aren't we breathing or feeling the breath of empty space, and things have become cold? Night is continually closing in on us. And so do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? This is the irony, that if we have killed off God, which the madman is saying we have done, modern society has killed off God, and it does not have need of God anymore, then we must live up to the consequences. And he continues to try to evoke their awareness of this reality. And he says, do we not hear the noise of the gravediggers? They're digging a grave to bury God. And don't you smell the putrefaction, the decomposition of God? Because God is dead, and he remains dead because we have killed him. Okay, let's listen to the second half.
How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred game shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of them? There has never been a greater deed, and whoever is born after us, for the sake of this deed, he will belong to a higher history than all history hitherto. Here the madman fell silent and looked again at his listeners, and they too were silent and stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern on the ground and broke into pieces and went out. I have come too early, he said. My time is not yet. This tremendous deed is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars requires time. Deeds, though done, still require time to be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than most distant stars. And yet they have done it themselves.
So in the latter half, Nietzsche goes on to ask the question of, well, what happens next? We are the murderers of all murderers. So, and the creator of the world has bled to death under our knives. So what are we going to do? Are there any festivals of atonement, sacred games that we can invent to make up for these great deeds? The conclusion is, must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of this deed of having killed off God? And the answer implied here is, yes, this is what it means, because there are no intrinsic values left anywhere. We must now become the gods who define for ourselves what the values are. Okay? And he makes this statement here, which we'll come back to in a second. There has never been a greater deed than this deed of killing off God. And as a consequence, whoever is born after us, for the sake of this deed, he will belong to a higher history than all history hitherto. Okay, so from this point forward, the earth has been unshackled from the sun. Man now enters a higher history in which he will define for himself. And Nietzsche will want to seek out an individual, a child, a man of the human race, who will do this for the entire human race. Yet, it doesn't happen just yet, because the madman, he falls silent. His onlookers are staring in astonishment. The madman throws his lantern to the ground. The light goes out. It breaks to pieces. And he declares, "I've come too early. My time is not yet." But this tremendous event, it's already begun and it's on its way. It's still wandering, but it will reach the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars require times. Everything will come in due time. And then finally, he concludes, and this last paragraph was not read by the dramatic reading. It has been related further that on the same day, the madman forced his way into several churches, and there struck up his Requiem aeternam Deo. Led out and called to account, he is said always to have replied nothing but, "What, after all, are these churches now, if they are not the tombs and sepulchres of God?" Any and every remnant of religion is simply a memorial of something past. God is gone. That's pretty crazy, pretty powerful, is it not? Is the madman entirely mad? Not quite. The madman has identified the reality of modern society, which has no need of God, and he understands it more keenly than they do. For the ordinary man, it seems as though, I don't need God in my life anymore, and I can carry on just as before, but according to my own desires. The madman is saying, no, if you negate God, you have to replace him. You have to define the values for yourself and for the world. And that's a great burden. And this burden is played out in what he describes as amor fati. Amor fati are the Latin words for love of fate. So the human being now must affirm himself apart from any idea of God or reward from God. The human being must make himself good by defining that everything about being human is good. It's a love of one's fate. Something that Nietzsche refers to here is the myth of eternal recurrence. So take the worst possible scenario that you can think of, okay? And that being a part of some wretched human existence. The image that's given in one of his writings is, imagine a toddler, a young, sweet-looking child who's playing, just in his diapers. And suddenly, a wild pack of dogs comes upon this child and starts to tear the child to pieces, flesh and blood flying in all directions as the hungry dogs devour the babe. Now, that's a very sad reality from our perspective. But Nietzsche wants to say that if it is indeed part of the human experience, then we have the power now, since we are free from values given to us, we now must exercise the power to define this as good for ourselves. It's a love of fate. Simply because it is human, we must be able to affirm it, and in so doing, we actually do make it good. Now, of course, there is great problems with this outlook, but let's follow Nietzsche to his point. Because he will say that religion has been keeping the human race from actually raising up a powerful human being who will actually do this for us. In contrast, what we've done is looked to God. But God is not one of us. God is not human. And so we look to God as an other who imposes his moral standards upon us. Whereas we as a human race must will to power. We must raise up someone of our own who will be able to not succumb to the temptations of religious ideals and religious values, but rather assert power, assert domination over himself, over nature, over the world. And this is what we do, he says. So the sciences want to dominate nature, or the philosophies want to dominate ideas. Well, the Übermensch is the one who wills to power in every dimension of human existence. The Übermensch is the meaning of the earth. He is a human being. He's one of us. He's not an otherworldly hero, but he's the one who saves us in our own human predicament. He is the one who affirms human existence. He is a man who is at one with himself and overcomes all tenets of division between meaning and being, because his own being constitutes meaning. Okay? Somewhat of a godlike figure, what we've attributed to God in the past, but no longer an otherworldly God. but rather one of our own. And so it is now the goal of the human race to raise up this Übermensch who will be the leader in this will to power. And this is what he was referring to, as we saw earlier in that latter part of the parable of the madman, that whoever is born after us, we are awaiting now this Übermensch. For the sake of this deed, he will belong to a higher history than all history hitherto. Okay. So if we step back and look at these masters of suspicion, they each regard religion and the religious experience with great suspicion. For Freud, religion is a source of conflict, stemming from repressed sexual desires that are unfulfilled, such as the Oedipal complex. For Marx, religion is a story of class struggle, and it's the way the wealthy hold down the working class. And for Nietzsche, religion is what pulls one down and makes one weak and humble. It gives us these ideas of virtue as being meek and humble and loving and forgiving. But rather, Nietzsche is saying that is what has kept the human race weak. Rather, the greatest value is not to be humble and loving and forgiving, but rather the greatest value is power and to exercise that power. And therefore, we must seek one to raise up the Übermensch who will exercise this will to power. Now, is there truth in these ideas from Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche? We must acknowledge that there is some truth, that indeed religion can be distorted and exploited for the advantage of some and the oppression of others. But is that the essence of religion? No, it's not. There is something more here that is entirely lost. What Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche have done is they have reduced the richness of human existence to merely one aspect of it. For Freud, it's sexual compulsion. For Marx, it's a work in the economy. For Nietzsche, it's this idea of power and a will to power. But do sexuality, economics, and power encompass the scope of religion? Actually, they do not. Okay, so there are legitimate critiques here of the way religion has been abused throughout human history, but it's not the final say. Religion can be exercised in an authentic way that is quite different from the stance of suspicion. Now here's a statue of Atlas. He is the Titan that was punished by the gods for having revolted against the Olympian gods, and his punishment is that he will forever have to bear the weight of the celestial heavens. So he's holding up the sky. That's a great weight upon his shoulders. If you go to New York City, right in the heart of Manhattan, this is Rockefeller Center, you have a bronze statue of Atlas standing right there in Midtown Manhattan, across from Fifth Avenue. Now, what's on this other side of Fifth Avenue? Does anyone recall? Well, if you've ever been to the Rockefeller Center, then across from Atlas is this. That's the Cathedral of St. Patrick, the Church of God. And very interestingly, I don't know if this was the intention of the design of the sculpture when it was put in its place in the Rockefeller Center, but I had a friend who was visiting the cathedral, and he said it was after Mass, the doors were wide open, and he went up to visit the sanctuary. And standing from the sanctuary, he could look directly out through the main doors of the cathedral, and he could see from the position of the sanctuary looking out, he could see Atlas standing there, as if glaring up at God and throwing his fist into the face of God. This is kind of a symbol of the way the masters of suspicion see religion. So Atlas has been punished by the gods, and religion is this weight, this burden, this punishment that is forever on his shoulders. And so he stands in defiance of God. Is that the only way to experience religion? Is that the only authentic religious experience? If we look at the word religion, the Latin root is religare. Re is like repeat, to do again. Okay? Ligare is to bind or to connect, in the same way that ligaments connect bones and tendons. Religion connects God and man in a divine communion. It does not connect God and man as master and slave. Rather, religion is what brings the harmony that God intends from the very beginning. Remember, from the Christian perspective, God created us in love for himself, to share his life and his love with us. It's a very different stance. So what we have here is Albacete introducing to us considerations of religion. We can see it from the eyes of the masters of suspicion, how God becomes the suspect. Or we can look at religion in a different light. And that takes us to chapter 3. And it's a very, very short chapter. It's only 2 short book pages long. But what happens in chapter 3? We get really a cartoon that he describes. And in the cartoon, he sees a couple standing outside of a hospital in Manhattan. And of course, the New York streets are busy. There are cars, taxis, honking, people walking. It's a crazy busy scene. And this couple standing at the street corner there have in their arms a bundle. It's a newborn baby. And so they brought new life into this crazy, busy world. And what's the caption? The caption is, "Look, Harry, the world." Now, I can say that in a different tone. Look, Harry, the world. It depends on one's stance, how we see the world, how we see the God or the idea of God. Now, from the stance of suspicion, which is what you have in the Masters of Suspicion, it would be, look, Harry, the world. It's a dog-eat-dog world. It's out to get you. You're going to grow up. You're going to be manipulated. You're going to have your heart broken. You're going to get fired. You're going to experience depression. Human existence is miserable until you affirm it to yourself. Or there's another option. That's not your only option. And that's what's being conveyed in the cartoon. And that is, look, Harry, the world. Look, all of this was made for you. And you're going to grow up and experience it. You're going to get an education. You'll explore areas of ideas and thought and get a degree and get a job. You'll fall in love. And you'll have children, your own family. And you'll grow old watching your family grow and the generations after you. There's a wonderful human experience awaiting you, and we bring you into this world. Look, Harry, the world. That's a very different stance. That's the stance that religion proposes to us, that we look at our human existence and we look at the world in a very positive light, because in our Christian faith, we believe that we have a God of love who created all things out of love, and it's very good. As God says in Genesis, after each day of creation, it is good, and at the end, it is very good, and it is holy. So let's take a look at that last chapter. And that's the entire chapter you see there. The title, What Matters is Wonder. So we have that description of the cartoon. And Albacete goes on to describe the religious experience. Religious experience is a human experience, a human passion like many others. It expresses the power, the energy of human life itself. In fact, religious experience can be seen as the fundamental human experience that unleashes passionate curiosity. To be religious does not mean to kill off your curiosity. It does not mean to simply bow and worship God and blindly believe. Rather, it opens the doors to what matters. And as this chapter is entitled, What Matters is Wonder. It sparks passionate curiosity and wonder in all at this grandeur of the world we live in. It is this passionate curiosity, he continues, that sustains the efforts of science, for example, as well as other creative human enterprises. Because when we are creative, when we're exploring and learning the laws of physics and mastering the creation around us, we're entering into God's creative powers. And all the same, with the development of the just social order and equitable distribution of human resources, seeking to establish a just world is again participating in the design and ideals of the world as a just God has given it to us. It is the same passionate curiosity that energizes children in their wondrous exploration of the world. Religious experience is not directly an experience of a reality beyond this world. Isn't that interesting? Religion is not simply about something that's beyond us, but rather in our Christian faith, that which is beyond us has come to us here and now. That's the incarnation. God from all eternity chose to become a human being. He has a human face. It isn't that I suddenly see the other reality. All I see is what is in this world. It is a way of experiencing this world as a sign of a reality that is always beyond its limits. This is a very sacramental point of view. That's a very Catholic notion, sacramentality, that the ordinary things here and now, your very human existence in time and space, the beauty of creation, the experience of watching the birthing of a child, the celebration of a birthday, the celebration of a wedding, love of two persons committing themselves for life to each other. All that we experience in being human is a window into the reality of the here and now, pointing to something beyond. There's always something more. The cell mutation research by scientists of social inequities confronted by an activist, the ladybug pondered by a child. All of these point to this mystery at the heart of everything that exists. Religious experience, therefore, is not an escape from this world. It is an affirmation of this world. Religion affirms our present human existence. It is not the yoke of suffering and the working class. It is not the opium of the masses. Rather, religious experience is a way of standing before reality. And this is what we were speaking of in terms of wonder. The reality that each of us encounters in our lives, our work, our relationships each day, and regarding it with a passionate curiosity. How is God speaking to me in this beautiful sunset? Or this breeze that caresses my face? Or the kind gesture of a friend? It's a contemplative posture, he says, before all that exists, in contrast to that posture of suspicion. Like the wonder of that mother holding her newborn child and saying, with joy and anticipation, look, the world. That's all that counts. All that counts is wonder.